Dan, a woman lover, lived in a small village. He was rich, very rich. His wealth was known far and wide, but more than his riches, what Dan loved the most was women. He had a heart for them, and every woman knew it. Whenever Dan saw a woman he liked, he gave her money gifts, anything she wanted, and because he was so rich, women came to him easily. They smiled, they followed, and Dan welcomed them. Dan married a beautiful woman named Adaku. Adaku loved Dan, but she wasn't like the other women. Adaku was strong. She was stubborn. In the whole village, no one dared to cross Adaku. Her eyes were like fire when she was angry, and her words were sharp like a blade. But Dan didn't care. He loved his beautiful wife. They had children together, and Adaku took care of the home. Even though Dan loved other women, Adaku stood by him, watching, waiting. Everyone in the village knew Adaku was not a woman to be played with. And so Dan's life was full of riches and women. But little did he know, trouble was coming. Adaku loved Dan deeply, but her love came with fire. She didn't like how Dan's eyes wandered to other women. It made her heart burn with anger. Whenever Adaku saw Dan talking to another woman, her face would twist with rage. She didn't care who it was. She would fight them, scream at them, and send them running. Even though Adaku had children with Dan, her heart stayed restless. She loved him, but his love for women made her feel like the ground was shaking beneath her feet. Dan's eyes were always looking for the next woman, and it made Adaku furious. One day Dan came home with news that turned Adaku's world upside down. He had married another wife. Her name was OT, and she was beautiful. So beautiful that Dan couldn't resist her. OT had smooth skin, a quiet smile, and eyes that seemed to shine like the moon. But to Adaku, OT was like a thorn. From that moment, trouble started in Dan's home. Adaku's heart was full of jealousy, and OT became her target. The house that was once full of peace began to tremble with fights and anger, and the storm that led to Dan losing his manhood was just beginning. OT was gentle, with a soft voice and a quiet way of moving. She never wanted trouble, but Adaku didn't care. From the day OT entered their home, Adaku's anger grew like a wildfire. She couldn't stand the sight of OT, and she made sure OT felt her wrath every day. "Go and sweep the house," Adaku would command, pointing with sharp eyes. OT would quietly obey, sweeping every corner while Adaku's children sat and laughed at her. "Fetch water," Adaku's voice would ring out again. And again, OT, with no other choice, would pick up the water pot and walk to the stream, her feet dragging with exhaustion. While she worked, Adaku's children played, laughing at how much their stepmother had to do. OT couldn't take it anymore. She went to Dan, hoping he would help her. But Dan didn't care. His mind was always on the next woman he could marry. He barely listened to OT's complaints. "I'll talk to her," Dan would say, but his words were empty. He never did anything. And so, OT had to endure. Every day, Adaku made her life harder and harder, and there was no escape. She worked, she suffered, and there was no one to save her. Dan's eyes never rested. Even with Adaku and OT in his home, his love for women grew stronger. One day, while visiting the town, Dan met another woman. Her name was NECA, and she was different from the village women. She was young, with smooth skin, bright eyes, and a smile that could stop anyone in their tracks. Dan couldn't resist. He married her without thinking twice. But NECA wasn't like the other wives. She didn't marry Dan out of love. She only saw his riches, and in her heart she thought, This old man won't last long. When he dies, I'll take everything and leave this village forever. When NECA moved into the house, the piece that was already broken shattered into pieces. Adaku, who once ruled the house with her stubbornness, felt threatened. OT, who already suffered in silence, now had to deal with NECA's boldness. NECA was not like OT, who quietly did as Adaku commanded. No, NECA was bold, and she refused to be pushed around. She didn't care about Adaku or OT. She wasn't afraid of Adaku's fiery temper or her bullying. She refused to do any chores, and she made sure everyone knew that she was in charge. Even Adaku's children had to listen to her. Go fetch water for me, NECA would say, and the children had no choice but to obey. Even Adaku's sharp words couldn't stop NECA from doing as she pleased. Dan, as usual, didn't care. He was blinded by NECA's beauty, giving her whatever she wanted. Adaku and OT's complaints fell on deaf ears. And with NECA's arrival, the house became a boiling pot of anger, jealousy, and trouble. The storm that began with OT was now a raging fire, and there was no stopping it. When Adaku or OT tried to complain, Dan would wave them off. He didn't want to hear it. He was too busy enjoying NECA's company to care about what the others had to say. Dan, can't you see how she treats us? Adaku would shout, but Dan wouldn't even look up. OT, who had long endured Adaku's cruelty, realized something important. The only way to handle NECA was to team up with Adaku. Though Adaku had always been her tormentor, they both shared the same goal now. They needed to get rid of NECA. And so, Adaku and OT, once enemies, came together. They whispered and planned, knowing that if they didn't act soon, NECA would continue to control the house. Their plan was simple. If they couldn't defeat NECA alone, they would do it together. The two women became allies in their fight against the one woman who had disrupted their world. Adaku and OT knew Dan too well. His eyes always wandered toward the young and beautiful, and that gave them an idea. If they could find a woman more beautiful than NECA, Dan's attention would shift. He would forget about NECA, and she would lose her place as the favorite wife. We need someone he can't resist, Adaku whispered to OT one night. OT nodded, agreeing that this was their only way. After days of thinking, OT remembered a woman she had seen in the village. Her name was Tashi, and she was just the type Dan liked. Tall, with skin as smooth and shiny as polished clay, and legs that seemed to go on forever. Her sweet smile and gentle eyes made heads turn wherever she went. She's perfect, OT said with a sly grin. Adaku's eyes lit up. They knew if Dan saw Tashi, his heart would leap, and he would quickly make her his wife. Their plan was set. They would introduce Tashi to Dan, and just like that, NECA would be pushed aside. The power would shift once again. Together, they approached Tashi with their plan. They offered her gifts and promises, telling her that Dan would spoil her with riches if she became his wife. Tashi, eager for wealth, agreed without hesitation. And so, the trap was laid. Tashi began spending time near the popular palm wine cellar, knowing Dan would soon notice her. Adaku and OT waited, watching closely, certain that their plan would work and that NECA's reign in the household would soon come to an end. Just as Adaku and OT had planned, Dan's eyes fell on Tashi one evening as she sat by the palm wine cellar's stall. Her tall figure, glowing skin, and sweet smile caught his attention immediately. Dan's heart skipped a beat. Without wasting time, he approached her, and within days, he made up his mind. Tashi would be his next wife. Dan married Tashi, and soon she was brought into the house as the fourth wife. Adaku and OT watched with satisfaction, their plan unfolding just as they had hoped. They knew Dan's heart would now be distracted from NECA, and the power she once had would slip away. But NECA, when she heard the news, was furious. Her face burnt with anger, and she couldn't believe that Dan had married yet another woman. She rushed to him, her voice trembling as she begged, "Dan, please. You don't need another wife. I am enough for you." Dan looked at her calmly and said, "NECA, that's how I married you too. Adaku and OT were here before you came. You'll get used to it, just like they did." NECA felt like a stone had been dropped into her chest. She couldn't believe how easily Dan dismissed her feelings. He didn't care, the same way he had married her while Adaku and OT were already in the house. Now Tashi had joined them too. NECA had no choice but to accept it, but her anger boiled inside her. Meanwhile, Adaku and OT were celebrating silently, knowing that the balance of power had shifted once again. Tashi was in the house, and now it was NECA's turn to feel the sting of being pushed aside. NECA's heart filled with frustration as each day passed. She watched as Adaku, OT, and Tashi grew closer, whispering and laughing together, leaving her out. She felt like an outsider in her own home. Whenever they sat together in the evenings, sharing stories and jokes, NECA would sit alone, anger swelling inside her. She couldn't take it anymore. She decided to visit her mother, hoping for some comfort or advice. Her mother listened quietly as NECA poured out her frustration, telling her how Dan was now showering all his attention and gifts on Tashi. "Mother, I can't stand it. He hardly looks at me anymore," NECA cried. But her mother was calm. She stroked NECA's hand and said, "Patience, my daughter. Remember why you married Dan in the first place. He's old. Soon enough, he'll be gone, and all his wealth will be yours." NECA nodded, trying to calm herself. Her mother's words made sense. She had married Dan for his riches, not for love. All she had to do was wait. But waiting wasn't easy. Every day, Dan gave more attention to Tashi, gifts of gold earrings, necklaces, new clothes, and NECA's frustration only grew deeper. The sight of Tashi glowing with Dan's love made NECA's blood boil. She had been patient for too long, but she knew deep down that her time would come. For now, she would wait, but her anger bubbled under the surface, ready to explode at any moment. One bright morning, it was Tashi's turn to cook for the entire household. The sun had barely risen when Tashi started preparing the meal. As the hours passed, the aroma of spices and herbs filled the air, wafting out of the compound and reaching the neighbors. People passing by sniffed the air, wondering if there was a celebration happening. The smell was so rich and delicious that even the birds seemed to stop and enjoy it. Tashi had outdone herself. She prepared a soup so flavorful that by the time she finished, the whole house was buzzing with excitement. The wives, children, and even the servants sat eagerly, waiting to taste the meal. When it was time to serve, Tashi brought out bowls of steaming hot soup with fresh, soft swallow, and everyone gathered around to eat. As they dug in, their praises filled the air. "Tashi, this is the best soup I've ever tasted," Adaku exclaimed, licking her fingers. "Yes!" "What's your secret?" OT added, her eyes wide with surprise. Even the children, who were usually picky eaters, ate until their bellies were full. Everyone was happy, chatting and laughing as they ate. The joy of the meal filled the compound like a festival. But as everyone enjoyed the food, NECA felt uneasy. She had noticed something odd. Dan, who was usually out chasing women or sitting around, hadn't been seen all morning. It was unlike him to be so quiet, especially on a day when the house was filled with such delicious food. While the others continued eating and praising Tashi's cooking, NECA's mind was racing. Where is Dan? She thought. Normally, Dan would have been the first to eat, but he hadn't touched the food and no one seemed to notice. Her eyes scanned the room, and the uneasy feeling in her stomach grew stronger. Something wasn't right. NECA pushed her bowl aside and quietly stood up, her heart pounding with worry. She needed to find out where Dan was, but a strange fear kept her steps slow. Why hadn't anyone else noticed, she wondered, and why did everyone seem so calm? With her heart in her throat, NECA decided it was time to investigate. Something about this feast felt very, very wrong. As the day wore on, Dan's friends arrived at the house, wondering where he was. They had planned to meet him for a big party, and Dan, who never missed a gathering, was unusually late. The friends called out from the gate, but there was no sign of him. "Where's Dan?" one of them asked when the wives came out to greet them. Tashi, calm as ever, smiled and said, "He's gone out early this morning. He won't be back for a while." Dan's friends were puzzled. Dan would never leave without telling them, especially not on the day of a party. Still, they trusted Tashi's words and were about to leave when NECA, who had been quietly watching, stepped forward. "No, something isn't right," NECA said, her voice tense. "He hasn't been seen all morning. We need to check Tashi's room." The other wives and Dan's friends exchanged confused glances. Tashi looked unfazed, her face still as calm as ever. "Why would Dan be in my room?" she asked sweetly. But NECA didn't back down. Her heart was pounding, and the strange feeling she had all morning was now too strong to ignore. "I don't know," NECA replied, "but we need to look." Reluctantly, they all followed NECA to Tashi's room. The air felt thick with tension as they opened the door. Inside, the room was quiet, too quiet. NECA's stomach turned as her eyes swept across the space. Then, suddenly, she gasped. There, lying on the floor, was Dan. His hands and legs were tied tightly with ropes, and his mouth was stuffed with cloth. Blood stained his clothes, and the sight made everyone freeze in horror. But the most shocking part was what was missing. Dan's manhood had been cut off. A scream tore through the room as NECA backed away, her hand covering her mouth. Adaku and OT stood in stone silence, their faces pale. Dan's friends rushed forward, untying him quickly. But it was too late. Dan's body was limp, his eyes barely open. The once proud and powerful man was now broken and bleeding. Tashi stood in the doorway, her calm smile gone. She didn't say a word as the horror of the scene unfolded in front of her. The terrible discovery shook the house to its core. The man who had once ruled over his wives, chasing women and living in luxury, now lay powerless, his life hanging by a thread. The house, once full of laughter and joy from the feast, had turned into a place of fear and shock. And now, everyone's eyes turned toward Tashi, knowing that she held the key to this nightmare. The news of what had happened spread quickly through the village. It wasn't long before a crowd gathered outside Dan's house as Tashi was held down, her arms tied, and her face no longer calm. The air was thick with whispers, and everyone waited for her to speak. They wanted to know why she had done something so terrible. As the silence stretched, Tashi finally lifted her head. her voice cold but steady. Yes, I did it. I cut off Dan's manhood, she began. The crowd gasped, but she continued without flinching. I couldn't take it anymore, Tashi said, her eyes blazing with anger. Dan couldn't stop, one woman after another. Even after marrying me, he couldn't rest. Just yesterday, I saw him with another woman, holding her close. She was beautiful, young, and I thought, here we go again. Another one he's planning to bring into this house. The crowd listened in shock, hanging on to every word. I followed them, watching, Tashi continued, her voice growing more intense. He was laughing with her, touching her face, and I knew then that he would marry her. I wasn't going to let that happen. Not again. I wanted it to end for good. If I cut off his manhood, he couldn't marry any more women. No more chasing after anyone. But then, Tashi paused, her voice trembling slightly. I didn't know the woman he was with was his sister. A murmur spread through the crowd. Dan's sister, not another woman. Tashi's eyes darkened as she continued her confession. I thought she was just another woman he wanted to marry, she explained, her regret slowly surfacing. I didn't know. I thought I was saving myself from being pushed aside again, just like his other wives before me. So I planned to stop him once and for all. Then Tashi turned her cold gaze to Adaku and OT. But I wasn't the only one. Adaku and OT, they were in on this too. They had their own plan. They wanted to teach NECA a lesson. So they came up with the idea. They said we should cut off Dan's manhood. That'll stop him, they said. That'll make him stay home. But they didn't have the courage to do it themselves. I did. The villagers turned their eyes toward Adaku and OT, who stood frozen. Adaku, always proud and strong, now looked small and afraid. Oti's hands trembled as she tried to speak, but the guilt was written all over her face. Adaku stammered, It was just talk. We never thought she would actually do it. But the truth had been laid bare. Tashi's jealousy and misunderstanding had driven her to commit the terrible act, and Adaku and Oti's schemes had only made the situation worse. The villagers could hardly believe what they were hearing. A mix of jealousy, misunderstanding, and betrayal had led to the destruction of Dan's household. As Tashi's confession hung in the air, the villagers stood frozen in disbelief. But the shock wasn't over yet. And the soup you all ate this morning, Tashi added, her voice cold and chilling. The meat in that soup, it was Dan's manhood. A wave of horror swept through the crowd. The women gasped, and the men stepped back in disgust, their stomachs turning as they realized what they had consumed. The once joyous feast had turned into a nightmare beyond imagination. Adaku, who had been silent until now, saw her chance and tried to slip away quietly, hoping to escape the villagers' wrath. But before she could disappear, someone grabbed her arm. Where do you think you're going, Adaku? A voice called out. The crowd quickly surrounded her, and she was forced to face their angry stares. Adaku's face went pale as she realized there was no way out. Trembling, she stammered, I didn't mean for it to happen this way. It was just a moment of anger. I was so frustrated with Dan's endless marriages. I only suggested cutting off his manhood out of desperation. I didn't think Tashi would actually do it. The crowd erupted in murmurs of disbelief. So it was true, someone shouted. You planned this? Adaku's eyes darted around, desperate to find a way out. It was just talk. We were all angry, but I never wanted it to go this far. I just wanted him to stop chasing women. But the villagers weren't convinced. The damage had been done, and Dan's life was lost because of Adaku's careless words and Tashi's cold actions. Oti stood quietly to the side, her face filled with regret. But Adaku was at the center of it all. The whole village was stunned by the evil that had taken place in Dan's house. What started as a plan to get rid of one wife had spiraled into something dark and twisted. The once proud and stubborn Adaku was now caught in the very web she had helped spin, and the villagers could hardly believe what they had just witnessed. The tale of betrayal, jealousy, and anger had reached its darkest point, and the weight of their actions fell heavily on Adaku, Tashi, and the entire village. Dan's fate was sealed. Despite the villagers' efforts to save him, the injuries were too severe, and he died not long after. His once powerful presence in the village was gone, leaving behind a household shattered by betrayal. The village elders gathered to decide what to do with the women involved. Tashi, the one who had committed the unthinkable, and Adaku, whose jealous schemes had led to this tragedy, were at the center of the storm. OT, though less involved, had still been part of the plan, and her role couldn't be ignored. After long discussions, the elders reached their decision. Tashi and Adaku were to be banished from the village for their crimes. They could no longer stay among the people they had betrayed and deceived. Tashi's cold actions and Adaku's poisonous jealousy had no place in the village anymore. OT, though her involvement wasn't as deep, was also sent away, as her silence and participation had contributed to Dan's downfall. The villagers gathered at the edge of the village to watch as the women were forced to leave. Their heads hung low, and their once proud faces were now filled with shame and regret. Adaku, once feared and respected, was now a shadow of her former self, and Tashi, who had entered Dan's house with plans of wealth, left with nothing. The village, still shocked by the events, decided that Dan's children would inherit his property when they were older. They would be cared for by relatives until they were old enough to claim their rightful place. The house that had once been full of laughter, jealousy, and turmoil now stood quiet, its story forever marked by tragedy. As the years passed, the tale of how Adaku and Tashi betrayed Dan spread far beyond the village. People whispered about it around fires, and the story became a warning for others about the dangers of jealousy, greed, and revenge. Though time moved on, the memory of that fateful day lingered in the hearts of the villagers, reminding them of the darkness that could grow from within. The once great Dan, brought down by the very women he trusted, became a ghost in the village's history, and the story of Adaku's betrayal would never be forgotten. I hope you enjoyed the story. If so, please like the video, comment what you learned from the tale, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more enchanting tales just like this one. Thank you.